A new survey shows young adults are worried about the coronavirus pandemic. The results from GenForward, which surveys racially and ethnically diverse young adults, found majorities across party lines say they are worried or very worried about the spread of COVID-19. The survey also found many young adults say the coronavirus is the most important issue facing the country right now. For more on this, I want to bring in Cathy Cohen. She's a professor of political science at the University of Chicago and the founder and director of the GenForward Survey Project. Professor Cohen, welcome. So great to have you with us. So why does it seem that young adults find the coronavirus pandemic to be the most important problem facing the country?
Well, I think we could expect that this is an issue that is pressing for all people at this point, right? It is confining whether they can, if they're young people, if they can go to school. It is it's putting their jobs in jeopardy. It is making the issue of paying rent a really a difficult situation. I guess I would also say that when we break down the data by race, however, and look at young African Americans, they name actually racism as the most important issue, followed by the coronavirus. And I think they see those two as linked.
Right. It's important to make that distinction for sure. The survey also found that the majority of Democratic and Republican young adults say they will definitely vote in the presidential election in November. What do you think prompted them to say this, and what impact can all of these young adults going to the polls have on the election?
Well, the great thing about surveys is that if you catch people at the right time, they're very excited about an election, and many people say they're going to the polls. I think what's special about this moment is we saw in 2018, for example, a substantial increase in the number of young people who went to the polls. If we think about it, millennials are now the second group in terms of the largest group of eligible voters. So having young people excited about this election could really matter. One thing that we found in our data that I think is important is that when we look at the difference between, for example, Trump and Biden, those young people who say they're voting for President Trump say they're voting for him because they're excited about his candidacy. Those young people, the majority of young people who say they're voting for Vice President Biden, say they're voting because, in fact, they dislike the other candidate, namely President Trump. So we have to wonder if the kind of negative excitement of voting against Trump will lead these young people to the polls in ways and in numbers that the Democratic Party is expecting. But I think, when we think about the fact that young people have been in the streets, that they've experienced the kind of corona pandemic, that their lives have been disrupted, that oftentimes they are essential workers or, they're marginal workers. They have an investment in trying, in fact, to kind of set the country on the right track. And part of the ways in which they said they want to do this is to go to the polls. I'll just say really quickly, there are some worries, however, in particular for the Democratic Party, that young African-American men and young Latinx men at higher rates are saying, in fact, that either they'll vote for someone else, meaning neither Trump or Biden, or they will stay at home and not vote.
That is interesting. Professor, a majority of Democrats and independents say racism remains a major problem in our society. You pointed out that for some segments of your survey, that remains the most important, right up there with COVID-19. But they have different sort of takes on it. So while the young Republicans you surveyed say it does exist, they largely say it's not a major problem. And so they also differed on the ways to make racial progress in the U.S. Does your survey have any clues as to what is causing this divide in perception?
Well, I think, we also have a set of questions where we ask this question about, do you think the discrimination against white Americans is as great as the discrimination against African Americans? And what we have found is that over time, increasing numbers of young whites believe themselves to be at risk, vulnerable, and facing the same levels of discrimination as, for example, African Americans. I think because of the precarity of their economic trajectory, meaning for many young white people, they don't believe, in fact, that they'll do as well as their parents, right? Again, because of the nature of the coronavirus, I think these young people believe themselves to be vulnerable. And they see that there is racism in the world and racism clearly in the United States and anti-Blackness, but they don't understand themselves or maybe their families to be the perpetuators of this racism. Right. And so they minimize it. And I want to be very clear, though, about trends. What we have seen is increasing numbers of young whites saying racism is a major problem in the country. However, when we look at party, we see that young Republicans, who are predominantly white, are less likely to say that racism is a major issue. They're also, for example, when we ask a question about the Confederate flag, is it a symbol of racism or a symbol of Southern pride? Majorities of young Republicans are more likely to say that the Confederate flag is a symbol of Southern pride, whereas the majority of Democrats and independents are more likely to see the Confederate flag as a symbol of racism. So while we have a narrative about young people going into the streets, young people across race, I think we have to be a bit more nuanced and a bit more careful when we're talking about, in particular, the racial attitudes of young people, in particular, young whites who identify as Republican.
Interesting. All right. So your survey also asked about policing, which is, of course, a big topic today.
Yes.
What did young adults have to say about that?
Well, you know, I'm a social scientist. I'm going to say it's complicated. I think at a surface level, when we ask a question such as, are police necessary for safe communities, young people majorities across race and across parties say yes to that question. Now, again, I think that's a surface level, interaction or engagement into this question. When we ask a question like, should we be investing in building a new institution of first responders who will, provide mental health services and social services, who will focus on de-escalation, we also see majorities of young people across race and party saying yes to that. We also see significant numbers of young people who are saying that maybe the police should be defunded, not abolished, they say, to some degree defunded. So I think what we're seeing is young people know, or I should say many young people believe, that in fact the police in its current structure does not work, and it doesn't work in communities of color, especially for African Americans. And they're searching for ideas about what that restructuring might look like. I think we have to have a kind of broadened and expanded understanding and discussion of public safety so that we can begin to think about the question of what would a kind of reimagined commitment to public safety that would reduce a reliance on the police, but also really redirect the funds that we're providing to policing to provide for investment largely in communities of color or marginalized communities. And I think that's what we're seeing with our data, right? If you take one data point, you tell one story, but if you look at kind of multiple data points, you can tell a much more, again, nuanced and complex story about how young people want to rethink, right, public safety in communities.
All right. Well, Professor Cathy Cohen, thank you so much. It's always great to get the perspective of young people on the current issues we're discussing every day. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.